Hey Ricky, thanks for joining us.
Hey Monica, how are you?
Doing good,
Barry should be along any minute.
right? No rush. Got an item before you,
Yep,
but you're glad you're here.
me too.
See, look at other people. Oh, makes it even better. Okay, I didn't know that. Okay, then I'm not missing anything. Okay, all right.
Chair Stewart, we have a quorum whenever you'd like to get started.
Terrific. All right. Well, why don't we get started then? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Stewart, the COG Board Chair, and I'd like to call to order and welcome you all to the March meeting of the COG Board of Directors. Thank you to everyone who is joining us today. This is a virtual meeting. Next month in April, we'll be back in person. And just a reminder that if you have not, please mute if you're not speaking. And our first order of business is to say the Pledge of Allegiance. So if you are able to, please stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. Now for the chair's report. Again, just please remember to mute your microphones. And if you like to speak, you can unmute and then return to mute. You can, if you'd like to speak or have a question, there is a chat box that you can request to speak or put your question there if you'd like us to ask the question for you. As a reminder that our webinars audio and video are being live streamed on the COG website through COG's YouTube account. And I'm going to turn it over now to Monica, who will complete a roll call to document your presence at the meeting today. Monica, you want to go ahead?
Okay, thank you. For the District of Columbia, I have Ms. Beverly Perry. Is there anyone else from the District of Columbia on? Okay, from the state of Maryland, I'm going to run through all the names and then see if I missed anyone. I have Michael O'Connor, Jessica Fitzwater, Denise Mitchell, Emmett Jordan, Craig Moe, Evan Glass, Kate Stewart, Tom Dernoga, Bridget Newton, Talisha Searcy, Joy Schaefer, Fariba Kasiri, and Tara Jackson. Am I missing anyone from a Maryland jurisdiction? Okay, and from Virginia, I have Justin Wilson, Christian Dorsey, Catherine Reed, Penny Gross, Rodney Lusk, Julie Briskman, Phyllis Randall, Mark Wolf, Daryl Moore, Ann Wheeler, and Andrea Bailey. Am I missing anyone else from Virginia?
Good evening.
I see we have someone joining us by phone. Could you please introduce yourself?
Mayor Timothy Adams, Maryland.
Thank you.
Great. Terrific. Thank you, Monica. So one of the things I'd like to just mention today is in recognition of International Women's Day is today. The theme for this year, yes, really. The theme for this year is Embrace Equity. So as we are celebrating the accomplishments of women across our country, across the world, we also want to be talking about the need for true inclusion and the work on equity. And I know COG and our board are very much aware of the need to have these conversations. And I just want to thank all of you and hope that you will embrace equity, not just today, but as we move through this year. And for the women in your lives, please give them a shout out today. So the other announcement I have is please make sure to save the date for the COG Leadership Retreat scheduled for July 14th and 15th in Cambridge, Maryland. Additional information regarding registration will be available soon and will be sent out after the meeting. And now I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Clark Mercer, for his report.
All right, thank you, Chair Stewart. Everyone can hear me okay? Good. This is not my view from the new offices, COG offices. We're testing out some backgrounds, so Thank you to our comm staff, and we'll share those with COG staff and members. We'll have some choices for y'all to use, and feel free to use them if you want moving forward. Last month has been good. A lot of in terms of housekeeping on my plate. A lot of meetings, both internal and external. I'm in the middle of sitting down with each member of COG staff. Did about 15 of those meetings yesterday, and 15-minute back-to-back meetings to get through our 130 some odd staff. They're going well. External stakeholders, Board of Trade, Leadership Greater Washington, Connected DMV, Northern Virginia Transportation Council Commission, met with the Safety Commission for Metro a couple weeks ago with Conti. Conti and I are meeting with General Manager Randy Clark of Metro this Friday. So getting some good meetings with outside stakeholders done, and also enjoying getting out to meet members of COG in your jurisdiction. So if you have not been contacted yet, just be patient, but I'm looking forward to coming out and hearing from you what's going on in your hometowns and how COG can better serve you. Got a couple quick updates, and then we'll move the agenda along. The Fair Housing Plan, we're about halfway through the 60-day public comment period, and that involves COG and the 8 jurisdictions that are participating. We've gotten some good earned media for COG, and with our housing manager, Hillary Chapman. We've been in the Washington Post, the Washington Business Journal, as well as other local news sites. Appreciate Chair Stort and our past chair, Christian Dorsey, for joining other community leaders on a video promoting the plan. So we've got all the information on our website, and what my ask would be of you would please be to amplify the fact that we're in a public comment period through your social media and contacts in your counties and cities. The more input we get on the Fair Housing Plan, the stronger that product will be. In the transportation space, I think Conti will join us here, but he is in the middle of a federal certification reviews. Folks, give me a thumbs up. I'm getting texts that maybe am I coming through okay? Okay, good, awesome. Our Transportation Planning Board and transportation folks are going through a federal certification review right now. That is every 4 years, the Secretary of Transportation makes sure that the MPOs throughout the country are following federal procedure and policy. So Conti's in the middle of that. He's also in the middle, and TPB's in the middle of kicking off their next long-range transportation plan, which is, are you ready for this? We're doing a lot of branding. We go from Visualize 2045 to Visualize 2050. So they've got some technical support that's allowing for jurisdictions to submit projects, programs, and policies for inclusion in that plan. And if there's a federal dollar going on a road or a transit project in this MPO, it's got to be in that long-term, long-range planning document. So that is very important, and Visualize 2050 is going to be undertaken over the next several months and will be completed, let's see, by December of 2024. 2 weeks ago, COG presented to Chairman Mendelson and his oversight committee, and we appreciate the chairman's questions and supports. He said he went a little easy on me my first year, and his questions will get harder as the years go on. So that sounded like a good challenge to meet. Sticking with DC for a moment, Scott Boggs from Homeland Security and I attended a really, really great ribbon cutting that Mayor Bowser headlined with Secretary Mayorkas and the head of FEMA. The new DC Homeland Security and Emergency Ops Center is a phenomenal space. So congratulations to the district, and it's a space where I hope we can use it in the future to bring our emergency managers and police chiefs and fire folks together. On electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure, this has come up a couple times. And I'm pleased to report that the first meeting of the Regional Electric Vehicle Deployment Working Group is going to be held on Thursday, March 16th. So COG is helping facilitate a plan for the region to make sure that our electric vehicle deployment makes sense, where the charging stations go, make sure there's some equity there and that they're throughout communities and not in just certain segments of counties. And to make sure that as you go from one jurisdiction to the next, it's seamless and there's a plan that's been coordinated. And then lastly, the PFAS Summit. So this is the Forever Chemicals. This is part of our Water Policy and Science series. We're going to have a special briefing and discussion on PFAS in our environment, and that's going to be hosted at DC Water headquarters on Wednesday, March 22nd. And so that's going to be a variety of folks from across the region. Information's on our website, but Penny Gross was encouraged us to make sure we were looking into some of these issues and bringing folks together to discuss them. So PFAS is next up, and that's on Wednesday, March 22nd. And hope you can join us. Information's on our website. And that concludes my report today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Executive Director Clark. I just want to make sure my screen is frozen. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I'm frozen, but I can hear and see all of you. I'll try and fix it as we go through the meeting today, but we can move on. Next, are there any amendments to today's agenda? You, honey, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. All right, seeing none, we will move on then. Our only voting item today is under agenda item 5, approval of minutes from February 8th, 2023. Is there a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
Gross moves approval.
I had Supervisor Gross move, and then I think Supervisor Bailey was second. Is that all right?
Yes.
Great. I have a motion and a second. Since we're virtual, just a reminder, I'm going to ask if there are any abstention or nay votes. And if you want to abstain or you're a nay vote, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, seeing no abstentions or nay votes, I'm going to say the motion passes. Okay. Agenda item 6 is our consent agenda items, but we have no items for the consent agenda today. So we're moving along at a brisk pace today. Agenda item 7 is our Region United local examples of implementing our equity emphasis areas. I have to say, I'm very excited about this. This week, we actually had a pretty robust discussion regarding equity emphasis areas here in Montgomery County. And so I'm looking forward to talking with the board today about this. And as we are, look at accelerating action around the planning goals in the Region United Metro Planning Framework, we're going to be talking about the accomplishments we've made in our equity emphasis areas. Today, we're going to hear from some of our board members on how different jurisdictions are using the equity emphasis areas in local planning and policies. But I thought before we did that, we would hear from Conti to give us a brief overview of what equity emphasis areas are, and then just to remind us all and level set. And then we'll turn to the city of Alexandria, the city of Frederick, and Montgomery County to provide us with examples. So now I'll turn it over to Conte to get us started. And if folks, again, just if you remember to mute if you're on a phone or a video, so we can all hear Conte.
Chair Stewart, if I may, I think Conti is still held up in this federal certification review. So if we could go directly to Mayor Wilson and we can loop back to Conti when he's able to join us, if that works.
Yep, that sounds great. So our first example, we're going to hear from Mayor Wilson in the city of Alexandria, and he's going to be talking about how the city used the equity emphasis areas in their mobility plan and housing zoning plans. All right, Mayor Wilson, it's all yours.
Very good. Thank you, Chair Stewart. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to briefly share some of the work that we've been doing in Alexandria to apply these equity emphasis areas. If we can move to the next slide. Let me first of all say that, oops, yeah, there we are, perfect. These came at a perfect time because it really gave us a factual data underpinning for some of the work that we had set out to do. So for us in Alexandria, we adopted several years ago an all Alexandria resolution, a racial equity resolution, really committing ourselves to further and actually bring life to the words that we have used for a long time around equity and making sure that every Alexandrian has an opportunity in our community. If we can move to the next slide. So for us, the equity emphasis areas in the city are no surprise for us. I think first of all, in the northeast corner of our city, our land area, one of the most significant Central American populations in the region. On the west end of our city, on the ring along 395, where some of the region's first high density multifamily development occurred in the 60s and 70s, as well as a whole section of garden style apartments, and then in the center of the city, where we have significant amounts of older housing stock that exists in our community. And I think we have allowed and we have ensured that these equity emphasis areas inform how we think about our land use decisions, our housing decisions, as well as transportation, as well as how we plan, capital projects and allocate a $2.4 billion capital improvement program. If we can move to the next slide. From the land use perspective, we are putting these concepts in place right now as we speak. So we recently concluded the adoption of a new Arlandria plan, accelerated in response to some of the pressures that were accentuated by the Amazon announcement, but really were pressures we've been dealing with for 2 decades. And we went with a Spanish first approach in being responsive to some of the data we saw and making sure that the community had an accessible planning process that they could engage in. Right now, we are kicking off an Alexandria West plan, kicking off a plan to replan an area of our city with the region's most significant Ethiopian population and a large East African population outside of Ethiopia that is along, again, our 395 corridor. And this is a planning process. We are using some of the same engagement efforts that are guiding us, using these equity emphasis areas to help kind of focus those attentions. If we can move to the next slide. Not unlike some of the other jurisdictions in COG, we are about to relaunch in a couple of days what we call our Zoning for Housing initiative. This is really building on a whole variety of different COG initiatives. So certainly our as Executive Director mentioned a couple minutes ago, the fair housing work that we are doing, this is drawn directly from some of those findings. But the housing targets that we adopted as a COG several years ago, and really using the equity emphasis areas as a way to make housing decisions and ensure that we have the housing supply necessary to both address economic growth, but also to be reparative to some of the patterns of segregation that have persisted in our community and date back to policies from generations ago, some of which are still in place and still find their ways in our zoning code. And so we are looking at a whole variety of reforms in our zoning policies that will help us address housing supply issues and affordability challenges, but also address some of those past barriers to housing access in our community that persist today. We can move to the next slide. We're also using the equity emphasis areas to help us guide how we provide social services. As I mentioned earlier, we have this ring of equity emphasis areas that are along the 395 corridor, and that's where most of those who are receiving social services in our community reside today. However, the buildings and the facilities that provide those services have traditionally been on the east end of our city and are spread out in a number of buildings on the east end of our city. And so as of actually, I was just touring it the other night, as of this month, we are in the process of moving into a brand new building that we purchased to consolidate all of these social services adjacent to those equity emphasis areas on the west end of our city, really bringing the services to those residents in need. We're also layering a whole new set of services focused on that. And some of them are mentioned on this slide, work we're doing around housing. We also have two very large committed affordable housing projects, including some of the most deeply affordable units that we've ever been able to develop that are under development right now, just under 600 units in 2 of our equity emphasis areas, both in the east end of our city right now. If we can move to the next slide. And we certainly use the equity emphasis areas to guide our update to our transportation master plan, what we now call the Alexandria Mobility Plan. This was very much a principle for us as we looked at prioritizing different transportation initiatives. We know if we look at our equity emphasis areas that we have disproportionality in crashes and where who becomes victims to the kind of the violence that plays out in our streets with automobiles. And we know that some of the policies that we can put in place to help ameliorate some of those challenges need to be focused on those equity emphasis areas. And so as we went through that community planning process, you'll see those areas being prioritized, those projects being prioritized to help reduce some of those challenges throughout our community. We can move to the next slide. And that has certainly informed how we're looking at transit. I know I've talked previously at the COG around some of the work that we're doing around fare free transit. We also adopted a complete redo of our dash transit route structure, making sure that we focus the transit capacity we have, the frequency and availability of transit on the areas of our city most in need of those transit services, where we have the greatest population, where we have the greatest job centers, and that has necessarily focused that transit capacity in the equity emphasis areas around our community. Move to the next slide. And we know that the folks who tend to live in equity emphasis areas, unfortunately, due to a lot of structural barriers, have not tended to be the folks who have the loudest voices in our budget prioritization and in our government. And so being more intentional about how we use equity emphasis areas to make funding decisions, capital budget decisions, has been vitally important. The most recent capital improvement program that we're now reviewing that just came out a couple days ago has, for the first time, an equity component that's informed by our equity emphasis areas as a driver in how we made capital decisions. So that's certainly been an area that we have focused on and will continue to focus on as we move forward and make decisions around how we expend taxpayer dollars. We can move to the next slide. That's pretty much it. We have really tried to jump in with gusto in using these equity emphasis areas to inform a variety of different ways we provide city services, and we appreciate the factual basis that COG has provided in helping us drive good decision making in our community. So thank you very much, Chair Stewart, for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we're doing, and I look forward to hearing what other folks are doing as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor Wilson, and for jumping in there. And I think we now have Conte, who has been able to join us. And so he can give us a good grounding in how COG came about deciding the equity emphasis areas and where we are with that. So I think I'm turning it over to Conte now, correct?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I apologize for being a little bit late. If there ever was a good reason for being late, probably this might qualify. Where I was in the COG Building Training Center, bragging about how this region is using equity emphasis areas, and I particularly mentioned Alexandria and Montgomery County. So the Federal Highway and the FTA team is here. They're reviewing a whole host of things that we do at the TPB, but they really wanted a deep dive into the equity emphasis areas. So that's why I'm late. But back to a refresher, the board will recall that a couple years ago, it adopted these equity emphasis areas as a critical element of the regional planning framework, where the genesis of the equity emphasis areas comes from the Transportation Planning Board, which is required to do what the feds call environmental justice analysis. In spite of the name, it has nothing to do with environment as much as it has to do with addressing and determining if the planned transportation investments in the region are going to have an adverse and disproportionate impact
Oh, yeah.
on low income and racial and ethnic
Oh,
minority populations. So that is what we were required to do. And TPB and COG staff got together and said, how can we identify the specific areas within our region where we have low income and racial ethnic minority populations at high concentrations higher than the regional average. So that is in essence what the equity emphasis areas are. There are 364 census tracts in our region. There are total 1,300 census tracts in our region. 364 of them are census tracts where you have higher than regional average concentration of low income and minority populations. And we've said the population living in these areas have traditionally been underserved in transportation, underserved in their housing needs, underserved in their economic opportunities, and generally in their livability. So that is the basis for COG adopting this as a planning framework, not just for transportation. And today we have just heard from Mayor Wilson about how the city of Alexandria is using that planning framework, both in their zoning reform that will help address housing, amongst other things, and also for the transportation with the Alexandria Mobility Plan. We know that Montgomery County was one of the early jurisdictions that took some actions, and we will hear from Mr. Glass about some of the initiatives within Montgomery County. They have similar use of equity emphasis areas in their planning and zoning, and also in the daily day-to-day mobility of people within those communities through their Shovel Our Sidewalks program. Then we'll also hear from the mayor of the city of Frederick, where they are also looking to improve the livability of communities within this equity emphasis areas and how they are using EEAs in their improvements to the parks. So that's the general, all of these briefings today are this panel discussion is advancing what we said at the start of this year, accelerating action to achieve our regional goals is the theme this year for COG. Board meetings. And last month you heard from staff what are some of the opportunities to accelerate action related to high capacity transit station areas. And today we are hearing from your own colleagues as to how they are advancing or accelerating actions with regards to equity emphasis areas. So that's just a broad refresher about the equity emphasis areas. Page 18 in your packet provides a summary, more detailed technical summary, and we have dropped a link in the chat for where you can access the equity emphasis areas tool, because it's a GIS tool. You can open it up, you can zoom in into a jurisdiction, and you can see the communities that have been designated as equity emphasis areas. That's a quick overview, Madam Chair, and I turn it back to you once again with apologies for being late.
No worries, Conti. Thank you so much for that update. And we will now turn to Montgomery County. And Council President Glass is going to provide us an example of the work that is being done with equity emphasis areas in the county. So I'll turn it over to you, Council President Glass.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And as you and I are on the same floor in the same building, we got to make sure that your internet connectivity gets resolved. That might be the first thing I do after this presentation.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
but thank you for organizing this conversation as you noted on International Women's Day, embracing equity, and I think it is absolutely appropriate. So thank you for that. As has been noted, I appreciate hearing what Alexandria is doing, and the work that Montgomery County is doing is similar. And I also appreciate COG for developing the equity emphasis area framework a number of years ago, which has been adopted with gusto here in Montgomery County. If we can go to the next slide. So Montgomery County, the work that we've been doing has been predicated on a law that we passed a number of years ago, the Racial Equity and Social Justice Act. And that requires the county to look through the lens of racial equity and social justice when we are evaluating legislation. when we are evaluating a number of aspects of business before the body and before the county, including zoning, legislation, and some budgetary priorities, special appropriations as well. And it has been a very useful tool as we try to create legislation and policies that support all of our 1.1 million residents. If we can go to the next slide, please. So Montgomery County, we have the honor of having 4 of the 10 most diverse communities in the entire country. They are Germantown, Gaithersburg, Rockville, and Silver Spring, and they are all within our 500 square mile boundary. And you know, that is really why this work is so important, trying to be fair and equitable to everybody. You can see on this map the details a little fuzzy as it's in this smaller box, but basically the equity emphasis areas are in the greater Gaithersburg area up along 270, and then also in the Aspen Hill, North Wheaton area in the mid part of the county, and then clearly the eastern part of the county along Colesville Road and the border with Prince George's County, Silver Spring, Colesville, Burtonsville area. Those tend to be the highest areas of need where we have the greatest difference in household income. And important to note that nearly 1/3 of all Montgomery County households are considered lower income. And that is 56 out of the 250 census tracts that we have that are equity focus areas. If we can go to the next slide, please. And so it was using that information that I decided to include and predicated the rationale for the Shovel Our Sidewalks Act, recognizing that it is in the equity emphasis areas where there is less car ownership, there is more dependency on public transportation, more dependency on pedestrian and bike infrastructure, which typically is lacking, but the need is certainly there. And so a few years ago when we had a few snowstorms, which seems like it was a very long time ago, I introduced and passed the Shovel Our Sidewalk Act, recognizing that these communities need help, that people are literally and physically walking the walk. They're sometimes stranded outside their homes, stuck at bus stops, and they need help as they're trying to get to and from work or meeting their other basic needs. And so also recognizing that there are hundreds and thousands of sidewalks in Montgomery County, I wanted county government to help people where they were at. And so the Shovel Our Sidewalks Act requires the county government, the Department of Transportation, to provide sidewalk shoveling for the equity emphasis areas and for a handful of the equity emphasis areas, which is really just 40 miles. And these are the 40 miles that we know transit dependency, pedestrian dependency is greatest in the county. And so we worked with the Department of Transportation and the communities to identify those areas of greatest need. There was a price associated with it as well, but I will say that climate change is real, and we haven't needed to implement this yet because there hasn't been any snow of accumulation. But it was an important way to codify the equity emphasis areas in the communities where this is really needed. If we can go to the next slide as well. Just earlier this week, the Transportation and Environment Committee, of which I'm chair, and Chair Stewart is also a member, we received an update on the Green Banks program, where we provide millions of dollars in county funds for private investment into their infrastructure, greening of their infrastructure. And when we expanded the scope of the Green Banks last year, we actually codified allocating 10% of our energy tax to the Green Bank. So money that's been derived from energy sources could be used to make sure that we green our infrastructure, we put some strings attached to that legislation and required that those funds be used, 20% of those funds be used in equity emphasis areas to make sure that environmental equity was part of this legislation and these expenditures. And so while the legislation required 20% of this investment to happen in our equity emphasis areas, they've actually exceeded that goal. I think it's around 23 or 24% of the investment is in equity emphasis areas. And so while we're using these characterizations, categories for transportation, we're also using it in the greening of our infrastructure. And if we can go to the next slide as well, there's a lot more that we plan on using these equity emphasis areas for. We actually just had a conversation with our planning department yesterday, and the planning department uses a similar category that they call equity focus areas, equity focus areas, that the framework for which was based on equity emphasis areas. And so they are using that in all of their planning and zoning, similar to what we just heard from Mayor Wilson in Alexandria. But the reality is that I think this can and should be applied to so many other aspects of policy making and to budget making as well. And look forward to the conversation, and clearly look forward to hearing how other jurisdictions are using this. But I think we're using it as COG intended, and there are many more intentions that remain on the table. So Chair Stewart, thank you for allowing us to showcase what we're doing here in Montgomery County.
Great. Thank you, Council President Glass. And it seems I was able to fix my technical difficulties during that presentation. So thank you very much for that. And now we're going to turn it over to Mayor O'Connor, who will discuss what the City of Frederick is doing.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity to showcase what we're doing in the City of Frederick. We always love to tell the story of what's happening in Frederick, because out here on the edges of the region, we want, particularly those of you who are closer into the district and Montgomery County and Prince George's County and Northern Virginia, to recognize that there is a progressive mindset in Frederick City and Frederick County that we're really proud of, and so we love to talk about that. I want to apologize from the outset. I don't care what the groundhog said. Spring has arrived because my allergies are here, and if I have to take a break to get some water, or hopefully not cough too much, I'll try and spare you too much of the gory details of that. But back in February of 2020, and you can go to the next slide, the City of Frederick engaged in a disparity study. So we wanted to look at our procurement opportunities in the City of Frederick. By August of 2020, shortly after the murder of George Floyd, we adopted equity as a fundamental value, a resolution in our city to look at everything that we do through an equity lens. By March of 2021, we had launched a Parks Master Plan, which is what I'm going to mostly focus on today in speaking with you. By July of 2021, we created our first equity office in the City of Frederick. We hired an equity program manager to help us to implement many of the things that we had been working on up until that point. In January of 2022, our equity, can't read my handwriting here now, I apologize for that. We began using equity impact statements on many of our agenda items. So we were taking the things that we had done in theory and trying to put them in practice to really articulate why the things that we do are important. And then just in July of 2022, this past July, we added a second person. We doubled the size of that equity department to really give us a greater capacity to follow through on the things that we wanted to accomplish. In late 2019, the city adopted its first long-term strategic plan, and much of these things are outgrowths even of that process. But when we launched into our Parks and Recreation Master Plan, what we knew we wanted to do with part of that was to look at our overall park system. The City of Frederick has 75 parks, and those parks run the spectrum from large parks like Baker Park and our Carroll Creek Linear Park, which many people who come to Frederick are familiar with it, But there are a number of smaller parks, with 75 of them, a lot of smaller parks, a handful of acres that serve neighborhoods and provide critical recreation and social opportunities for residents that live in those neighborhoods. And what we needed to make sure we were doing was not putting all of our time and attention and dollars, quite honestly, into those parks that already get a lot of time and attention, but to ensure that as we built our capital improvements program, we were addressing the needs of those smaller parks, especially those parks located in equity emphasis areas. So in the last fiscal year, the last fiscal year's budget, the current fiscal year, we allocated $1.5 million to try and address some of those equity differences that we might be seeing. You can go to the next slide. So this is a hard to read map, like most maps that you throw up on PowerPoints are, but it's the city of Frederick. The blue areas are our equity emphasis areas. We also have a neighborhood advisory council system in the city of Frederick. So these are resident-led groups across the city that are helping to carry on the dialogue with city government about the needs unique to those neighborhoods. And these were created 20 years ago in an effort to try and make sure that regardless of where the elected officials in the city may come from, we're all elected at large in the city of Frederick, both the board, obviously, and the mayor. We wanted to make sure that at the resident level, at the neighborhood level, residents had a voice. And so the dots that are inside those blue areas are where we identified projects that are in our capital improvements program that are either completed, where there's funding in place, or where we propose to do project improvements. All of those green areas that you can see throughout this map are those 75 parks that I referenced earlier. You can go to the next slide. So the specific locations of these, I don't expect you to know and memorize, but if you'd like to come to Frederick and visit any of our 75 parks, we'd of course be happy to have you. But I think what I wanted to provide on the next couple of slides is just the array of different opportunities that are there when you talk about how to do a park enhancement to try and address equity considerations. So it's everything from rebuilding playgrounds and basketball courts, and we have specific capital improvement project codes that are aligned to recreational improvements, whether they be larger improvements of really constructing parks and parking enhancements, to doing rebuilds of older playground equipment or adding up a park pavilion, or in this case, improving the shared use path, which is we have an entire path network in the city of Frederick that we're looking to link into Frederick County's path system to really create better opportunities for residents that want to use that network for both recreational opportunities, but honestly, as economic development opportunities. They may be the best ways for some of our residents in some of our neighborhoods to access shopping or jobs or cultural opportunities. Because as was said in the earlier presentation from Mayor Wilson, not everybody has access to a vehicle. And we have to create, if we're going to be equitable in how we do it, easy opportunities for everyone to have access to the things that they need. One of the nice things about having 75 parks, and there was a whole aspect of the Parks and Recreation Master Plan that looked at this, is how close are an array of amenities available to everyone who lives in the city of Frederick, and setting a target for making sure that no matter what neighborhood that you lived in, you could access equitably the same services, the same programs, and the same amenities, whether you lived in our most expensive neighborhoods or whether you lived in our more affordable neighborhoods. And those blue areas on that equity emphasis map previously are our most diverse communities. They are our most affordable communities. We want to preserve the value of the naturally occurring affordable housing in those neighborhoods. And it's a balance as you work through these processes, because everything you do to improve a neighborhood, which is something you have to do, improves the value of the housing in that neighborhood. So we all know that there's a struggle as we work to make sure that every resident in our community has access to the things that they need. garden plots, community garden plots. Not everybody who lives in an apartment or in a townhouse has access to grow their own vegetables if that's something they want to do. Providing these community garden plots, particularly in these equity emphasis areas, becomes a really important opportunity for us. Next slide. We have some funding in place to do some renovations to outdoor courts in some of our neighborhoods, park buildings. The renovation of tennis courts and expanding basketball courts. We've got a strong push, as probably many of you know, in communities for creating more pickleball opportunities. There's always new ways in which we have to look to try and engage our community with the recreational needs that are important today, in addition to maintaining those recreational programs that have been around for decades. It's one thing, and we struggle with this, as you all do. Once you build it, now you have to maintain it. Now you have to own it and you have to fix it. And things age over time, they break down, and we have to make sure that we're constantly using a replacement or renovation CIP to look at our park system. And our Parks and Recreation Master Plan, the equity component of that is having us really prioritize using data how we should take on these renovation projects, that it can't just be the loudest voices in our most affluent communities that come to us, that we can point to a document that says we're using metrics to evaluate who's next in line for getting the improvements that they need. Next slide. And then we have a number of program areas where we're looking to utilize our CIP in the future to address needs in equity emphasis areas. So that's everything from playground upgrades, restroom improvements. This has been a common theme over the last couple of years. It was particularly acute during COVID, that the opportunity for people when they're out to use a public facility is not always readily available. We don't have a lot of open restrooms in our city 24 hours a day. And when you get to sort of the fundamentals of equity, the ability of someone to use a comfort facility conveniently, wherever they need to in the city of Frederick, is a really important equity discussion. And how you do that in a way that is safe, that is clean, that respects the dignity of every individual, these are important considerations. And so how we look at upgrading our restrooms in our parks becomes an important conversation when we do this. In addition to repurposing sports fields and adding pavilions. The article that's attached to the agenda today talks about a particular amenity in one of our parks, the Hill Street Skate Park. So we built a skate facility 20 years ago, and the interests and needs of the skating community have changed. They've evolved over those 20 years. That park has not undergone, that amenity has not undergone significant upgrades in those 20 years. So we're looking to try and find ways to cobble together the resources. It's going to be about a $2 million rebuild, to rebuild that skate park to be a more modern facility that more reflects the needs of the skating community today. So we're putting the dollars in place. We're trying to tackle these projects one at a time. You can go to the next slide. Because we know how important it is that we address equity in every neighborhood in our city, and our parks touch every neighborhood in our city. So what better way to link equity to our neighborhoods than to use our park system as the vehicle to make that happen? So I appreciate very much the opportunity to share Frederick's story. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing Frederick's story. So we got to hear from Alexandria, Frederick, and Montgomery County, looking at how equity emphasis areas are being used in transportation, housing, parks, climate change, budgets. And I think one of the things that I have very much appreciated about the work on equity emphasis areas, as we saw today through the maps and other things that, we're able to really identify places in our communities that many times have been intentionally and unintentionally overlooked, and then hold us accountable to that. And I think as elected officials, that is a really important tool to use. So I thank you all for doing that. I know many of you have also been using equity emphasis areas in your work, and I see Chair Randall has her hand up, so I will turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. All the information that you just gave me was amazing. I took pages and pages of notes. The one thing that I didn't hear talked about, and that I would appreciate just some ideas is that at least in Loudoun, not everyone is happy or thrilled about the fact that we're having these discussions about equity and equity emphasis areas. And you know, there are some people who don't want to understand because they just don't, and they'd rather have the issue than the answer. But there are some people who really are trying to understand what it is and what we're doing and how and why. So what do you say, especially to the people who spoke already, my colleagues who spoke, what do you say to the people who believe this is not needed? What do you say to the people who believe that by having equity emphasis area, it means that it's less for some people if it's more for others, which is obviously not true, but it's their truth. And so, you know, I don't ignore somebody else's truth if that's what they believe. So how do you talk to people who may not be really in this space, in this headspace with the rest of us?
I'll jump in if nobody else is. So Chair Randall, thank you for the question. So I'll answer that specifically regarding the Shovel Our Sidewalks Act, right? And the way I explained the fact that Montgomery County was going to start shoveling 40 miles of sidewalks in a specific area, which everybody would love government to shovel their own sidewalks, right? But the fact was, and remains, that in Montgomery County, the average household income is $108,000. And the average household income for our bus riders is $35,000. And so we already start off with this disparity. And during COVID, during the pandemic, and even today, as we are all virtual, not everybody has the luxury of being virtual. And some people have to go into work every single day. And if they have to go to work and they are already have more needs, so to speak, then we should be able to step up and help them. And that was the message, right? And so, sure, I got plenty of emails and tweets asking or requesting that government shovel their sidewalks, but my simple reply was what I just shared with you.
Okay, thank you.
And I would add in Frederick, I think that the conversation is about establishing objectives and using data and metrics to get there. So that when you're saying we want to make sure that we have X number of parks or X number of amenities within a certain distance of every resident of the city of Frederick, that's blind to the question of who gets what, because it's saying everybody's going to get access. We can't provide the same amenities everywhere, but we can provide everyone access to amenities as widely as we can. So using data, setting a goal, making sure that we're clear in our delivery of spending those dollars because we've measured, and this one is the next on the list. Not everybody's always going to buy it, but for me, it's about a justification. We can validly justify why we're spending the efforts where we are.
If I can jump in to try to take a swing at Chair Randall's question, because I think it's a good one. You know, I think we all get into government, right, to solve problems. That's what we're doing. So I think part of the answer to Chair Randall's question is demonstrating the connection to how looking at policy answers through this lens helps us solve problems, helps us actually solve the problems that our community is dealing with. And I think I'm glad Councilmember Glass mentioned some of the pandemic decisions we made, because I think they're particularly instructive. I can speak for experience in Alexandria. One of the ways we prioritize vaccinations was using the social vulnerability index in our community, a similar construct to the equity emphasis areas, and looking at areas that were particularly vulnerable to COVID and to spreading COVID. And so we prioritize vaccinations as using that construct. We got a lot of very, very, very specific and very hateful input in response to that prioritization. But what we did was we continually demonstrated, listen, here is the problem. It is folks in these areas that are particularly vulnerable and are driving our deaths, our hospitalizations, and folks who are in these high risk careers this helps us solve that problem. And I think you just have to keep making that case.
Yeah.
That's really
And-
helpful. Thanks.
And I'll jump in to say that, and perhaps someone on the COG staff could put the link to the presentations that we did during the racial equity learning series that a number of board members were able to go through last year. Because Chair Randall, that is a core question that we kind of looked at through that learning series, and I think some of the suggestions that the folks from the Government Alliance for Racial Equity provided us, and the tools they provided us were very helpful. So we can, I think all those presentations are up on the COG website, and they may, in addition to the excellent answers from our colleagues on the board, may provide some good information. In addition to that, we are going to have, I believe it's next month, the Chief Equity Officers come to our board meeting. We were trying to get them this month to do it all together, but people's schedules didn't allow. So we will have them at a meeting soon. And I think this is a good topic to dig in with them as well.
So thank you. And that would be really helpful. When we hired our chief equity officer, just upon the hiring and him being in the paper, the amount of really ugly emails that he received before I was afraid he wouldn't take the job, but because he was receiving, we were receiving emails about him and things that were being said. I mean, and I thank him every day that he remained, because before he even got here, it was really tough. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Again, I know a number of folks in other jurisdictions are putting these equity emphasis areas to work. If you want to share what your jurisdiction is doing, or ask our colleagues or COG staff any questions, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. All right. Just double checking. I'll go through since we're virtual. Any additional questions from folks in Maryland? All right. Anything from Virginia? Anything from DC? All right. Seeing none, I want to thank our COG staff and our presenters today for their information. And as I said, we will have the chief equity officers at a meeting soon. And COG staff did put the link to the racial equity learning series in our chat, and please let us know if there are additional questions around talking about the equity emphasis areas, the racial equity work, and we can help that inform future board sessions. So for our next item, then we will turn to agenda item 8 and move on to COG election officials committee regional update. We're going to hear from joining us is Ricky Keach, the Loudoun County Office of Elections Deputy Registrar, and Terry Stroud, the District of Columbia Board of Elections General Counsel. The committee coordinates on elections within our jurisdictions, and today they're going to be providing an update on local efforts to prepare for upcoming elections in the region. And I think I'm turning it over to Ricky first, correct?
Yes, good afternoon, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, members of the board. My name is Ricky Keach. I'm with the Loudoun County Office of Elections, and I am the co-chair of the COG Election Officials Committee. With me is my friend Terry Stroud, who is the General Counsel for the DC Board of Elections and Secretary of the Committee. Our co-chair, Allison McLaughlin, could not be with us today. I'd like to thank you for having us. The last time we were before you was in May of 2021. We were still trying to figure out how to run elections in a pandemic. Thankfully, that seems to be largely behind us now, and we've returned to what I will call a new normal state. The election committee has been meeting sporadically over the past few years, and we have been available to one another for support as usual. As we move into 2023, it's our hope that we can resume a more regular schedule of meeting. This year, my colleagues in Maryland and DC are taking a much needed breather while they begin preparations for 2024. But as usual, in Virginia, we are gearing up for state legislature and local races with primary in June and a general election in November. In Virginia, the state and local races typically see the lowest turnout for any of the elections we run, but with increased interest all around, we are anticipating record turnout this year. Since 2020, the way we vote in Virginia has changed pretty significantly. We now have 45 days of no excuse early and mail voting, which have been a resounding success and proven to be very popular throughout the state, especially in population centers such as Northern Virginia. In the 4 years preceding the 2020 general election, the average percentage of voters voting pre-election, either in person or by mail in Virginia, in Loudoun County was about 11%. Since 2020, when no excuse early in mail was implemented, the average percentage of voters utilizing these methods has risen to 46%. To put that into raw numbers, the 2014 congressional election, we had about 6,000 people that voted prior to Election Day. In 2022, that was 52,000. So over the course of 8 years, the number of people voting prior to Election Day in a congressional election has risen approximately 750%. We expect the interest in early and mail voting to continue as time goes on, and are preparing for that. In 2020, Virginia also moved the deadlines to request and return mail ballots. Voters can now request a ballot up to 11 days prior to the election and return them by either 7 p.m. on Election Day or postmarked by Election Day and received no later than noon 3 business days following the election. This year, very little elections-related legislation has made it out of the General Assembly session, and those that were passed do not appear to be anything that would significantly affect our offices or voter experiences. I'm not aware of any legislation on the federal level that is looking likely to pass at this time. As always, securing our elections remains a top priority for all election officials, and we continue to avail ourselves of training and resources to ensure the elections we run are safe, secure, and accessible for all voters. In Virginia, all localities are required to undertake a yearly security review, and that is currently underway in all counties. One thing we have seen over the past few years that continues today is an increased amount of interest in elections from various groups and individual voters. In Loudoun County, our office has received and processed over 350 Freedom of Information Act requests since August of 2022. Previously, we received about 3 per year. The requests touch all parts of how our elections operate, including requests for vendor contracts, copies of emails, voting equipment information and logs, cast vote records, and overall requests for information about general office operations and how we do things. While this means that many of our offices, including Loudoun County, have had to reallocate resources to handle the large volume of requests, we remain committed to ensuring that all voters feel comfortable with the voting process, and our office takes the time to respond to requests for information and answer any questions we can as they come up. This has led many of our offices to start a concerted effort to increase voter education through outreach and communications so that we can ensure that factual information reaches the voting public. That's all I have for you this afternoon, and I will now turn it over to my colleague, Terry Stroud from DC.
Terry, I don't know if you're speaking or on, but we can't.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ricky, and good afternoon, board members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. I know we're talking about upcoming elections, but the past is prologue and they inform our operations going forward. So I just wanted to talk briefly about the November general election, which we certified on November 30th. There were 205,774 ballots cast out of 504,815 registered voters, which amounted to 40.76% turnout. 36.44% of these voters voted in person either during early voting, which ran from Monday, October 31st through Sunday, November 6th, or on Election Day. 130,000, just under 131,000 voters voted by mail or by depositing their ballots into one of 55 mail ballot drop boxes that were placed throughout the city, primarily outside of public libraries. The work of wrapping up this previous election still continues, even as we are ramping up towards the 2024 presidential election cycle, which we anticipate will be represent larger turnout than in previous elections. For example, we're currently looking at returned undelivered ballots that we received in November and placing them into categories for return. We're entering this information into our voter registration database, and ballots are still being delivered from the U.S. Postal Service. The information that we receive from this mail that we receive from the ballots will inform our general list maintenance process that will begin soon, which I will discuss today. As we do immediately after every election, we held post-election briefings with our vendors whose equipment we use to execute our mission. We are in constant conversation with these vendors, assessing what worked well and what could use improvement. We conducted in-depth briefings with our election workers who are absolutely critical to our mission, and we will utilize their feedback as well as feedback from the public to inform future training and operations. I wanted to highlight one of our newest initiatives, our Restore the Vote program, under which DC residents who are housed in the DC Department of Corrections and in the Federal Bureau of Prisons for any convictions are permitted to vote. We had the following results in the 2022 election cycle with respect to these citizen voters. In the primary election, we registered 405 Department of Corrections residents, and 218 of them voted. 132 of them voted at vote centers that were operated inside the Department of Corrections, and 86 turned in ballots at the vote center or turned them in by mail. We registered 824 residents in the Bureau of Prisons, and 257 of them voted. And this is all in the primary election. In the general election, we registered 767 DOC residents, and 241 of them voted, 76 in person at the vote centers, and 165 by mail or at the vote centers dropping off the ballots as opposed to voting that day and dropping them off. 920 Bureau of Prison residents were registered to vote, and 403 of them voted. So we mail ballots to all of these voters, but we do conduct in-person voting at the DOC facilities. And in the general election, we employed 16 incarcerated residents to work as election workers. So they assisted with the process with the goal of providing a higher level of exposure and understanding of the election process. Pursuant to federal and district law, we will soon be conducting our biennial list maintenance mail canvas. This is a general list maintenance program that augments our daily ongoing list maintenance procedures, and it entails mailing notices to voters who did not participate in the November general election, asking them to confirm their addresses. We'll first mail a non-forwardable postcard to these voters, and based upon the feedback and information that we receive from the voters and the U.S. Postal Service in response to this mailer, we will take further action if necessary, including updating addresses, mailing a second forwardable notice that complies with federal law, and which could lead to an inactive status or removing voters. So these are options that could occur based on the information that we receive. This is just but one example of our efforts to ensure that we move ever closer to an accurate and up-to-date voter registry. And we will conduct an extensive voter education and outreach program ahead of the mailing so that voters know what to expect and how and when to respond. In terms of election legislation that will impact our operations, there are several pieces of legislation that became or are perhaps soon to become law, depending on who you ask, that we will be implementing as necessary. The most significant one is the Elections Modernization Act of 2022, or the EMA. This legislation is currently in the midst of a 60-day congressional review period and is scheduled to become law on May 3rd. As my colleague Ricky noted in his remarks, election administrators around the country had to make significant changes to the way that we administer elections as a result of the global pandemic. And for the district, that change looked like moving from a primarily in-person voting jurisdiction to one that encouraged and prioritized voting by mail, pivoting from precinct-based polling places to vote centers, and introducing mail ballot drop boxes in response to well-documented concerns about mail delays. These changes were successful and well-received by the voters. The EMA will, among other things, make permanent the most successful approaches from the 2020 cycle, including those that I have mentioned. We'll be mailing a mail-in ballot with a postage prepaid envelope to each voter and utilizing a solution that will allow voters with disabilities to access their mail ballot online, mark it, and return it by mail and potentially electronically, as military and overseas voters have done for quite some time. We will be establishing vote centers at which district voters can, or continuing in the use of vote centers at which any district voter can vote regardless of residence, and establish that a minimum number of drop boxes be distributed throughout the city. Another piece of legislation that is coming down the pike is the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2022. That's in question at the moment. This legislation would permit non-citizen permanent residents to vote in local elections. And finally, there is the Automatic Voter Registration Expansion Amendment Act of 2022. This legislation would move the district from a jurisdiction where a qualified elector has the opportunity to opt out of being automatically registered to vote on the front end, i.e. at the time of the transaction with the voter registration agency, to one where the opportunity to opt out would occur on the back end after the interaction with the agency. The legislation also adds the district's Department of Healthcare finance to the roster of automatic voter registration agencies, and it would apply for the most part beginning in January of 2025. So not for this election cycle, but upcoming ones. Our various divisions are hard at work in the areas of voter registration, voter education, and outreach, requests for data and other information, ensuring that voters with disabilities and language access and supported in our programs, and ensuring the strength and security of our technological infrastructure. We are preparing for the upcoming legislative changes, reviewing and updating our policies, programs, and regulations to ensure compliance. Our primary election is scheduled for Tuesday, June 4th, and the general election will, of course, be held on Tuesday, November 2024, and we will be ready. And I just wanted to take a point of privilege to say that I had an informational interview with a young gentleman yesterday who is in his first year in law school and is considering election law as a field. And he asked about the extent to which there was communication and interaction and collaboration among jurisdictions in the DMV around various issues, including, of course, election administration. And I was happy to point to MCOG as a primary example of robust and effective collaboration and communication around various issues that we in this area are facing, not just in terms of elections, but other areas, including the very important ones that we're discussing today. And so I just want to thank you all for the work that you do and for the existence of MCOG. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great. Well, thank you for that very much for those reports, and Terry for that last comment. It's glad to hear spreading the word about COG. So if colleagues have any questions, you can put them in the chat, raise your hand. I'll just kick us off. One question I have for the two of you, and I think Ricky, you started talking about this a little bit, but as we're looking at our elections moving forward, what are you all seeing as sort of like the greatest opportunities we have, and then also the greatest challenges facing us?
You want me to go first, Terry?
Sure, yeah.
In my opinion, the greatest opportunity we have is to educate voters on how the process actually works. And I think that ties into the biggest obstacle we face is that there's just an enormous amount of misunderstanding and misinformation out there right now about what we do. We in Loudoun were chosen to host the governor of Virginia, Governor Youngkin, in September. And he was, he attended our testing for our voting equipment, made a statement to the press afterwards. But one of the things he said when he spoke to our staff stuck with me is that we need to do a better job of making it clear what we already do to secure our elections. And I think that's what a lot of us are working on.
Yeah, I would say that for the district and probably other jurisdictions as well, we are trying our best to get voters to understand that we are the trusted sources in terms of information around election administration and voter registration, and that they should be coming to us and not relying on other less reliable outside sources to explain our story. And we do have to do a better job of telling our story and telling the truth about how election administration occurs. I think that, you know, when we moved from one way of administering elections to another one, we did that. You know, we had a primary election scheduled for June in 2020, and in March, you know, things changed drastically. And so we stood up these programs, and we now have the opportunity to fine tune and sort of fill in the gaps in terms of, you know, offering and enhancing these programs that work really well around the country. And so we're just, you know, doing all the work that we need to do to make sure that they are stronger and more effective for our voters. We have experienced, as Ricky discussed, an uptick on particular types of requests for information. We had a couple for inspecting and copying every single ballot that was cast in the 2020 election. That was never fulfilled because they realized that, you know, the cost of, you know, getting that information and having us make copies, although we were prepared to do it, it just became too much and too onerous for the requesters. So we are experiencing, you know, an uptick in those requests. We get data requests. I'm jealous to hear Ricky say that he only gets like 3 requests a year. We get more than that in the district, but it's the
No, I said we used to get 3 a month.
Used to.
Now we get hundreds.
Now you get a bit more. So yeah, I think we are laying a good foundation, and so, you know, I think that even challenges, you know, will be opportunities to improve upon our current programs. And so looking forward to what's to come.
That was very helpful. And you know, I think there is also good advice for us as elected officials, and also talking about more probably even when we're not faced with an election, but during non-election years, the really important role you all play in securing our elections and making sure they run smoothly. I think I saw Supervisor Briskman's hand up, and then Vice Chair Allen next.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I think Ms. Stroud answered one of my questions, and that was, are we seeing a regional uptick in the weaponization of the FOIA process? And it sounds like the answer is yes. I know we've been facing that in Loudoun County. A couple of things. I have noticed the Loudoun County Elections Office really stepping up the education, at least on social media, and I really appreciate that. And I just wanted to point that out to my colleagues, that I think that Loudoun County's education of the public on, you know, again, being the trusted source for how elections are run, I just think it's Loudoun County is a model for that. If you wanted to take a look at what they've been doing on social media, our elections office, I think it's been excellent. Ricky, I wanted to just clarify one thing on the, I think you said that our participation in voting is up 750%. So I just wanted to clarify that question. And then secondly, I wanted to know if we are seeing this regionally, which has happened in Loudoun County. Unfortunately, our electoral board has eliminated Sunday voting. We had one day where we could do souls to the polls and Sunday voting. And our electoral board removed that option, at least for the next year. I don't know if it's permanent. And so I wanted to find out if it's permanent, and also if we're seeing that in other parts of the state and regionally. So those would be my 2 questions. Thank you.
Hi, Supervisor Briskman. I can tell you that the 750% is the utilization of pre-election voting, early and mail. Since the congressional election 2014, it's increased about 750%. And I think that's a really important number because it creates an enormous amount of additional work on staff prior to the election. Previously, we would deal with maybe 6,000 people before the election. Now we're dealing with up to 50, 60, 70, 80,000. So it becomes, for us, the easiest way for people to vote is on election day, because we run our 100 precincts and everybody shows up there. But when the early in the mail begins happening, that's a more labor intensive process that's managed by staff. So it does create work on the staff. And you said what you said about our electoral board, and I can't add anything to that.
Well, my question was, are we seeing that anywhere else? Like in your COG committee, have you heard about it happening anywhere else in the region, in the state?
I don't know of anybody else in the state. I do know that there were not that many localities offering it to begin with.
Interesting. Okay.
So I don't think it was heavily utilized. And I will say, I think the reasoning behind it is that we are tied for the longest early voting period in the country. Terry, what is yours? 14 days, 10 days?
Well, up to 12 days, but we
Yeah.
started on October 31st, and
Yeah.
from Monday through Sunday.
Yeah, and we have 45 days. So technically speaking, our office is open for 33 days of early voting. So
I would just chime in the General Assembly, at least, Supervisor Briskman, there was a bill to reduce that early voting period from 45 days to 14 days. And it passed the House of Delegates and failed in the Senate.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe we can talk offline about the Sunday voting as well across the state. But thank you so much for your presentation. I think you guys are doing a great job. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. I'll turn over to Vice Chair Allen now.
Thanks so much. Ms. Stroud, great to see you, and
Good
proud
to
of
see
the
you
work that
too.
our DC Board of Elections is doing, and great to hear from our other jurisdictions. One quick question I want to ask from a regional perspective, so I'm not sure if I should direct this to Mr. Keach or anybody else. There's been a lot of news lately just about ERIC, our system that is really important, I think, for us regionally. And so I apologize if you guys talked about this early in your presentations. I joined in after it started. But in terms of making sure that our voter rolls are as clean as we can make them, especially when we have mobility across our region, was curious as we're seeing some states, which makes no sense to me, withdrawing themselves from these systems, which I think has to do with just the unfortunate politicization, culture war type of things that are happening in other places. Are we seeing any movement in that direction in our region? And just also, since we do have a fair amount of mobility from other states and jurisdictions around the country, any concerns or impact about that?
You want to go first, Terry?
Yeah, I am. Well, as
This is
you
a
were
tough
probably
one.
aware, we just recently had 3 states withdraw from ERIC, Florida, Missouri, and West Virginia. There are other states that are considering withdrawing, and I don't have much to add to that, except for that one of the reasons that we thought it important here in DC to participate in ERIC, well, you know, the Obama Presidential Commission on Election Administration highlighted ERIC and just other forms of information sharing among jurisdictions for the purpose of ensuring the accuracy of voter rolls. And it's certainly been a help to us. And so I do find it unfortunate that states are withdrawing at a time, you know, and list maintenance is an ongoing concern and has been, and remains a really effective way to ensure the accuracy of voter lists. And so, you know, speaking for the district, we are concerned about the trend in terms of information about ERIC and concerns that jurisdictions have raised about ERIC that are causing it to have members withdraw. And Ricky.
Yeah, I agree with Terry 100%. I can tell you that I've heard rumblings that Virginia may be on the cusp of withdrawal. I don't know that for a fact. I happen to be good friends with the commissioner, so that's something I'd like to follow up with her on. But I will say what Terry said, and my concern here is we border West Virginia in Loudoun County. So ERIC is the only way that we know if somebody who lives in Loudoun County moves to West Virginia. If that's removed, someone could move to West Virginia, remain registered in Loudoun, request a mail ballot, and they would receive it. That's my concern. I think politicization is the right word here. You know, I also don't know if ERIC's not the answer. I'm not sure throwing it out before we find a new one is the right way to go. And so I kind of echo what Terry said is we are constantly being hammered about our list maintenance activities and removing tools that may not be perfect, but that can certainly help, in my opinion, is not necessarily the way to go.
Yeah.
So yes, I think as a group, we are all very concerned about this.
Thanks. I don't, just real fast, Madam Chair, I don't know if that's something for a future action item. Maybe this is a body that wants to speak to our, you know, surrounding jurisdictions about why this is a really important part, especially in an area of high mobility within the region from a list maintenance perspective. But I am concerned with what I've seen with some other states moving in this direction, and I certainly hope we don't see us. But even West Virginia, to your point, has an impact for the district, has an impact for Virginia, probably for Maryland too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, people that live in West Virginia commute to DC.
Yeah.
All right, Vice Chair Allen, thank you very much for raising that. I'll turn now to Mayor Newton.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for this conversation. This is an election year in the city of Rockville. We tend to be off the track sometimes a little bit. We doubled our percentage of voters in the last election in 19. We went to vote by mail. We have one voting center at City Hall. The majority of our community was thrilled with the vote by mail, and even those who I think were not originally happy found it to be very successful. So we doubled the number of people in the city who voted, and that to me is a win-win. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Great. Thank you, Mayor Newton. I'll turn it over now to Supervisor Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had two questions. Well, one comment and two questions. One is, I think I agree with Councilman Allen. We really do need to make the Eric piece prominent in our minds as we go forward. Coming from Missouri, I can kind of understand how that happened, but our voter activity in Virginia is too active for us not to have our eye on the prize with that. So just my food for thought. The other question that I have was referring to something that that you mentioned earlier about, and I caught the end of it, about the voter registration changes, or who was allowed to vote. You said there was a change that was made. It wasn't for undocumented folk. What was it for? I forgot the terminology.
So I think two groups that I discussed were voters who are incarcerated in the Department of Corrections or the Federal Bureau of Prisons for DC under our Restore the Vote program. They can vote regardless of felony convictions. So before, individuals who were in jail for misdemeanors could vote, but now individuals who are incarcerated for felony convictions can vote. And so we mail them ballots. But then the legislation that is upcoming affects non-citizen permanent residents who reside within DC, and they will be able to vote in local elections should this be passed, should this be enacted.
Okay, so that is an enhancement and a change altogether, but okay, that's great.
That would be a change, yes.
Okay, great. And then for the last question I had was for any changes and sometimes this happens and you don't notice it on the voter registration application. Is there anything that we need to have our eyes on in terms of that, any changes there that voters may not see, or people that are registering may not see, that we need to be made aware of?
Well, for DC, depending on legislation that is enacted, we have to update our application. For example, as a result of the last election, the Libertarian Party lost major party status, meaning its ability to hold primary elections and to elect presidential electors. And so since we specify on our voter registration application the major parties, we'll have to update that. We also, in order to facilitate our program Restore the Vote, we're including information where we could get incarcerated citizens like facility ID or resident ID. So depending on the change, we always review and update forms as needed.
In Virginia, there's nothing that has changed as far as our voter registration application in the last few years.
Okay, just making sure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Supervisor Bailey. I am not seeing any other hands or anything else. Oh, sorry, Mayor Jordan. It blended into your bookcase. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Mayor.
Hey, thank you, Kate. Hey, what a great discussion today. What a timely discussion. We also have elections coming up in Greenbelt, and we're off cycle, as is the case in a lot of municipalities. I had a question though about security, election security, and with so many ballots, vote by mail, so many ballots going out in the mail. I'm just wondering if the jurisdictions presenting today have made changes to their process dealing with provisional ballots. And what I mean by that is when you mail ballots out, or someone requests the ballot, you mail it out, and they show up at the polls on the day of the election and they want a provisional ballot. And with the mail, U.S. mail being what it is, sometimes those ballots come in a little bit late. So I'm just wondering what you've done and what you plan to do to handle provisional ballots when a ballot has already been mailed to a voter.
Yeah, I can speak to that. In Virginia, and I can't believe I forgot to mention that we implemented same-day registration last year. I think maybe I was trying to put it out of my mind. It was traumatic. We went from about 800 provisionals to about 2,500. And that was 800 in a presidential election to 2,500 in a congressional. So we don't even want to fathom what next year might be. And in Virginia, to vote same-day registration, you do provisional. So the basic answer to that in Virginia, and I can tell you in Loudoun County, is that we don't count any provisionals until everything else has been counted. So basically what we do is we process our voter credit from election day. We process all the ballots that have been received by mail, all the early, and then we run our provisional voter ID list against those that have already voted to ensure that nobody is voting twice. I think that answers your question. There are a lot of safeguards in place like that. And those are best practice recommendations, is that basically process all the ballots you know are already counted, and then you move on to your provisionals. That way you can avoid the voting twice scenario.
Very, very good. It creates a scenario with more and more provisional ballots where, the election results are delayed significantly. And if it's a very close vote, where there's a recount, it really pushes things back quite a bit.
Yeah, we actually had, I'll tell you, for the first time ever, we had one race that flipped during the provisional processing period for one of our school board races. We had a few, or maybe it didn't flip, but the person who won on election night ended up winning by a handful of votes. But it was the first time we've ever actually had a lot of scrutiny on that process, because they actually, with the increase, you're absolutely correct, they could change results, especially in a lower turnout election.
And I will just say, for the district, we do have safeguards in place that prevent individuals from casting multiple ballots in the election. Ballot tracking, ballot accounting, our electronic poll book. So there are a lot of mechanisms in place. And of course, they've had to be adjusted as you move from primary in-person voting to mail ballot voting primarily. So we're just, continuing to fine-tune the processes, but we do have safeguards in place. And our provisional balloting has gone down, and same-day registration is a heavy lift, but I think it's worth it, and the voters love it. Sorry, Ricky.
It was incredibly popular. This
Yeah.
was our first year ever having done it. Nobody knew what to expect, and we got it done. We also have very short certification deadlines in Virginia.
Yes.
And that creates a bit of a pickle. So that's something that's being looked at as well.
And we had in 2010, I think, and my light keeps on going off because it's censored, but we started same-day registration in 2010 pursuant to the Omnibus Election Reform Act. And so we've had some history and experience with it. Most of our same-day registrants do tend to vote live ballots as opposed to provisional ballots, because you have to bring in ID, which has to be deemed valid in order for you to cast a vote. And so most voters do that. And so they tend to vote like live ballots when they appear to vote. So, but it's, we've had some experience with this. And so, and it does get fine-tuned, but we've been doing this for some time, and, voters love it. And so, yeah, I think it's a good program.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction. I'm glad you brought that up. Is in Virginia, we're prohibited from connecting our electronic poll books to one another in the precincts. So our only option is provisional, because we don't have any way of knowing if you've already gone to where you're registered and voted.
And that is something that is a distinction, because they are linked. Yeah. So we know where voters checked in throughout the city. Yeah.
We do it in early voting. So if you vote, for instance, in Loudoun County, if you vote in Purcellville, we know immediately everywhere that you've already voted. But on election day, we're not permitted to do that, which means everyone who does same-day registration has to vote provisionally.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for digging in on that piece. And thank you, Mayor Jordan, for raising that question. I am not seeing any other hands, and I am seeing our next speaker for our board meeting. So I'm going to wrap up this item. I'm going to thank Ricky and Terry very much for joining us today, and for my colleagues, and we can follow up on a number of the items that were raised. Our next item is
You're welcome, and thank you, board members.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next item is agenda item 9, Fighting Hate for Good, how to speak up against the rising tide of anti-Semitism, hate, and extremism. We are joined by ADL Regional Director, Meredith Weisel. A couple of weeks ago, Meredith hosted an in-depth briefing on the current rise of anti-Semitism nationally and locally in our region. And I know a number of board members were able to join, as well as staff in the region. And I think we received such wonderful feedback about how useful the webinar was, that we wanted to ask Meredith to come, and she's not going to be able to do the whole thing because that was, I think we did over 90 minutes last time, but we did want her to come and highlight a few things for the full board and have the opportunity for all of you to ask her questions. So with that, Meredith, I will turn it over to you. I don't think we're hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can hear you now.
Now I can't hear you. Hold on. No, my audio has been terrible today. Hold on. Okay, is that better?
We can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, now I can hear you. I don't know why, but for some reason my headphones are going in and out today. So as long as you can hear me, great. Okay, so do I have the ability to share screen?
Yes, you can just hit share screen at the bottom.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and let me just start. Great. Can you see the slides? Awesome. Okay, so this is going to be very short compared to the last time. Some of you will have seen some of these slides, and I'm really just going to kind of run through some of them really quickly and just kind of give a general overview. I know some of you know what ADL is. I want to just go a little bit of a background. So first, thank you, Councilmember Stewart. So Meredith Weisel, I am the Regional Director for ADL's Washington, D.C. office. We have 25 regional offices throughout the country, and each regional office covers X number of states. So my office oversees the work on the ground in Maryland, DC, Virginia, and we also cover North Carolina. So it's a fairly large region. I live here though, in the DMV. I live in Montgomery County. So shout out to all the Montgomery County people on here. So this is my home also, you know, when I know what's going on in the community. And just for quick background, so ADL was established in 1913. We've been around for 110 years. Our mission has been about combating anti-Semitism, but also securing justice and fair treatment for all. And part of that is that we really look at all forms of hate. They're equally serious and damaging. Those of you who were on the webinar heard me say that kind of consistently. And a lot of that is when we start seeing a rise in anti-Semitism, we see a rise in a lot of other forms of hate. And we, just a quick overview. So a lot of the work that we do, we investigate, we advocate, we educate. Educate is really the big piece of a lot of this because we've seen such a tremendous increase. And I will tell you all, coming out in the next few weeks, I can't give you the exact dates, but our audit of anti-Semitic incidents that we produce every year, 2022 data is coming out in a couple of weeks, and we are also releasing at the same time in a couple of weeks a report on white supremacist propaganda. And I will just anecdotally tell you the numbers are going to be alarming when they are released. And the reason why it is so concerning is because we're seeing this rapid increase of mainstreaming of hate in our communities. And just all encompassing, what does ADL do? So as I mentioned, fighting anti-Semitism, a huge part of that is combating extremism and wherever it is coming from, because we are not just seeing a rise in things like anti-Semitism Anti-LGBTQ plus hate is one of the highest that we've ever seen. We are continuing to see things like anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, anti-AAPI hate. I could go on, and it is just continually, and it's this perpetual crisis right now. A lot of that is because of online hate and harassment that we are seeing translate into real life. As the kids say, RIL, in real life. We are seeing fractures in our democracy. So I was glad to actually be on the part talking about voting rights, things like voting rights we are seeing infringed upon. And we're just not seeing people challenging their bias enough in the communities. I have this slide up just real quick. The reason why I put this up, it's called the Pyramid of Hate. And part of it is because the work that ADL does, it's really based on the understanding of the ways in which hate can grow and be challenged. And for you as elected officials and leaders in your community, it's so important to remember that something like hate is a progressive process, and it's something we know can be interrupted. And so at the end, I'm just going to kind of leave some tools and tricks. And this presentation can be in much more in-depth than that's part of what I did, the webinar that Councilmember Stewart referenced, but also several of you have already contacted me, and we're going to be doing this for your county council, the city council, or a larger presentation for your cities and municipalities. And so we would go in depth talking about the normalization of less damaging forms of bias and how we're seeing that lay a foundation for acts that we're seeing of things like assaults, desecration, vandalism, graffiti, and just things like propaganda. And so that's why we talk about the pyramid of hate. I want to just give you also a real quick definition of anti-Semitism and this is something we can go a little bit more in depth, not today, but the reason we're seeing a lot of anti-Semitism comes from conspiracy theories and stereotypes. And we're seeing the Jewish community targeted not just based on religious beliefs, but on things like we call tropes, and saying Jews are untrustworthy, they're disloyal, they're polluted. We're also seeing, unfortunately, an increase in, it is very fraught right now what is happening over in Israel, but we are seeing things like the delegitimization of the state of Israel and whether or not it should even exist. And it's affecting Jews globally, being blamed for something the Israeli government is doing. Again, not talking about criticism of the Israeli government, but just blaming Jews as a whole. And we're seeing this also becoming a little more normalized in our communities. And as I said, just common myths and stereotypes. This is why we're seeing such an increase in anti-Semitism. We're seeing things, and when we put out the white supremacist propaganda report, a lot of it is coming from that. They're saying that Jews are all powerful and controlling. They believe that Jews are satanic. And this is things that we've seen for millennia, and we're starting, unfortunately, to see history repeat itself. And the global population of percentage of Jews is very small. So that's why we're super concerned when somebody like Kanye West went on social media and said, I'm going DEFCON on Jews, when he has 30 million followers and there's only 15 million Jews worldwide. And people are believing that. It sounds crazy, and I'm sure to everybody on here, but it is actually happening, and we are seeing people feed off of it. Same thing like something like Holocaust denial. Because we're limiting what we can teach now in our schools, we're seeing Holocaust denial from people. And with that, this is our 2021 data. The 2022 data is just on the cusp of being released, so I would pay attention in the next few weeks. Again, I can't tell you when, but I can tell you what I know and what I've seen, that our region, DC, Maryland, and Virginia, are going to have some really large numbers, much more so than 2021. And the way we classify the data, it's going to be probably, anecdotally, I believe it's going to be the largest number we've seen in 43 years of when we started collecting data, 44 years of collecting data. 43 years was from 2021. And what we're seeing is a drastic increase of anti-Semitic incidents in our K through 12 schools. I don't need to tell anybody on here, Montgomery County has been front and center, unfortunately, in our public school system. Everything from something like a swastika being carved into a desk, to an anti-Semitic slur being yelled at a student, to pennies thrown at students, to other forms of graffiti. And we're just, what does that say? So, went backwards one. So this is really where we're finding out. Anti-Semitic attitudes in America have increased tremendously. These are literally just some quick data points. It's a comprehensive snapshot of current anti-Semitic attitudes in America. And honestly, I'm somebody who does this on a daily basis, and it was quite disturbing when I saw this. 20% of people who were surveyed said Jews have too much power. More than half of Americans believed at least one Jewish conspiracy theory or trope. So maybe they believe Jews control Wall Street, or Jews control Congress, Jews control the banks, or anything along those lines, or that Jews control other marginalized communities. And this is what we call the Great Replacement theory, where they believe that Jews are trying to bring in immigrants or non-white people, is how they phrase it, to infiltrate the United States. But Jews are the ones controlling that. And so it's a hate. That's why I say it's not just anti-Semitism. It is hate in all forms, because it's anti-Semitism in a way is we call punching up. They believe Jews are all powerful and controlling, satanic in a way. That's where it comes from, the trope that, or the conspiracy that Jews have horns, and that somehow we are controlling everybody else who they also hate. But Jews, it's punching up because we're trying to take us down, versus other marginalized groups they believe are already inferior. And so it's this weird conflation of hate that we're seeing manifesting in the community. But the real concern is the belief in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories has doubled since 2019. And this was a report we just put out a few weeks ago. As a resource for you all, don't look at the number on here. This is just a random screenshot, but we do have a resource for you all that is public. It's called our heat map. And what we do on this is we track hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism. So again, why do we not just track anti-Semitism? Because we are seeing, when we see anti-Semitism rising, we are seeing things like domestic terrorism increasing. We are seeing things like, as I mentioned, voting rights being infringed on, our democracy. Look no further than January 6th as to what happened at the Capitol and what we're seeing at school board meetings now. So Virginia in particular has had a lot of people like Proud Boys, which is an extremist group, showing up at school board meetings, trying to have this false narrative that schools are indoctrinating children. And by the way, they believe that Jews are grooming to create the LGBTQ plus community. Again, these are conspiracy theories that are out there from a lot of white supremacist groups, which is why I want to kind of highlight for you, this is new. So for those of you who are on the webinar, this information was not out. So what we have been tracking every year is murder and extremism in the United States. And our 2022 report has shown that, look, every year we are finding ties to a variety of extremist movements that are causing them to kill people. And we track these extremist murders because we see that where it ties in with things like hate-fueled background that somebody may come from. And what we know is that domestic extremists have killed at least 25 people in the US in 2022. Now, I will say the only good thing is this was a little bit of a drop from 2021, but we are seeing is a lot of the sort of the range from 2015 and up is still not decreasing. 2016 hit a high. There are some things that happened that year, but we really know that this is deadly. And so think of things like what happened in Buffalo at the shooting spree up in Buffalo, New York, Colorado Springs, Colorado at the LGBTQ plus club. And absent these mass killings, there only probably would be 10 what we would call extremist related killings. And so it's just really important to understand. And honestly, a lot of this also comes from gun issues, because we are seeing most extremists are employing weapons like bombs, explosives, and firearms. That's why we track the domestic extremism. And just to tell you also why we're concerned, the majority of it, so nearly 3 out of 4 killings, comes from white supremacists. And the white supremacist right-wing extremism is increasing more and more. Again, extremism in any form is certainly dangerous. But over the past decade, right-wing extremists have committed the majority of killings that we're seeing. And, you know, I don't need to explain to this region, January 6th, but this is always in one of my slides when we talk about it, because it's front and center. The reason why this is so concerning, and then I just have a couple more slides and I'll wrap up for questions, because most of the people who went to the January 6th insurrection were not affiliated with a particular extremist group. So I'm sure you've heard Oath Keepers, or you've heard Proud Boys, or you've heard 3%ers. The majority of people who went there were just people who were caught up in many respects and misinformation, disinformation, that the election was false, that they didn't believe that, that Trump lost. And again, I'm not being partisan in any respect. I don't care where anybody sits in the political spectrum, but it's something that we saw that is concerning, because these were everyday people who were fed information online in these random chat rooms, who were hearing it from elected officials in a lot of their communities, and it led to this deadly attack on the US Capitol. And the majority of people were not affiliated with a particular extremist group. And that's why it's concerning, and how widespread this gets, and why it increases a lot of forms of hate. So just real quick, these are just some headlines. These are things in our region that you have certainly seen, many of them. Some are national headlines. These are the ways we're seeing hate and anti-Semitism manifest. Just kind of pause. You can just look at the screen. So these are all different aspects. And we're also seeing, as I said, a lot of it tied to extremism. These are real images, that are coming. The Camp Auschwitz, in particular, is a man who lived. Those of you who are from Virginia, I'm sure, are familiar. And on the back of his sweatshirt, it said staff. This was a man not affiliated with any extremist group whatsoever, and marched through the Capitol. He is in jail now. But keep in mind, nearly 600 people were arrested from various states for their roles in the insurrection. And so this just goes to show how widespread we're seeing it. I'm going to skip this one because I want to get to the white supremacist propaganda. This is something that is the most thing we're seeing in communities. And normally we would say, oh, it's just flyers, it's just a sticker, it's no big deal. Unfortunately, we're now seeing people act out in this. There's a group called the Goyim Defense League, GDL. It's a play on ADL in the negative way. And you probably have heard of them. They are now harassing people in person in Florida and some other states, and they have a huge presence in our region as well. And we are starting to see them show up. Even Northwood High School in Montgomery County has had their flyers on campus. That's a brand new thing. So they are branching out, which is why we want people to report when this happens. And then just to kind of wrap up. So look, there are a lot of things that we can do as partnership in the community, but what I would just say to all of you is please continue to call it out. I know it sounds so repetitive. Okay, we need to make another statement. Oh my God, this happened again. But I also think we need to kind of get to the table together a little bit more. And I love the fact that COG exists here in our region, because some of this is such a regional aspect that we can be working on. We can Loudoun County's had issues, Montgomery County has issues, Prince William has had issues, the district has had issues. Like, let's figure out, Prince George's County, I could name, a lot of all the counties. Like, let's figure out how we can do some more coalition building. What kind of things, more teachings that we can do, more community events, looking at things like legislating, education on the Holocaust and other forms of genocide. We are seeing, our history. A lot of people are trying to clamp down on what is taught. I would also ask, even for you as elected officials, you hear something, say something. A lot of you on here, I have my personal cell phone, use it. Text me if you see something, law enforcement, messages you, let me know. We work directly with them to try and do the investigations. I'll leave this up for a quick second, and then I'm happy to, that has my email. Councilmember Stewart and many others on here know how to reach me. So with that, let me stop sharing, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Great.
That was like literally the abridged version. I've never given a 15-minute presentation ever.
Thank you, Mary. We appreciate you, Mary. And really, that was a very abridged version. I just wanted to highlight that for board members who are not able to come and spend the 90 minutes with us a couple of weeks ago, so that you would, one, just get a brief sense of what is happening, the scale at which it is happening. And then also, if you would like to go more in depth in your jurisdiction, as Meredith said, she is available. I will first turn it over to Chair Randall.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. So that was even that abridged version was excellent and scary. The call it out discussion, you know, whenever I put something, whenever I call it out on my on a social media page, invariably people come on and say, you know, like, why are you broadcasting the hate? Why are you making it larger? Why are you giving them a platform? And the people who say that are normally people who, you know, who are against it, who believe like I believe, who are allies in the fight. But it's always a line that I'm always not sure, like, at what point am I giving it a platform, or am I calling it out? And I tend to call it out more often than not. But
Yeah.
but am I giving it a platform? And what is your advice on where that line might be?
Yeah, so it is always a tricky question. It's actually like a question I get a lot from reporters. You know, they're like, "Well, we want to show this and we want to talk about it." And I say, "Great, blur out though some of the images." That is one thing I will say. So first and foremost, if you're going to share anything, particularly on social media, blur. You can share like kind of the framework if it's a flyer. I'm just using that as an example, and just blur out the imagery. We don't want to give them that platform. At the same time, if we stop calling it out, then they're like, oh, we can do it more. And, you know, we want to kind of, it's like, I used the example the other day because it felt like spring was coming. Now the winter's back, but like, you know, it's like the weeds. It's not the flowers that are coming up that are seeping up. And we want to push it back down. But at the same time, we have to still say something about it because we want to like send a message to the rest of the community. That's really where it comes down to. So are you giving them a platform? Kind of. You know, I mean, that's why people say, well, why do you put out a report on white supremacist propaganda? Aren't you just giving everybody their information? And it's like, yes, but at the same time, we need the public to be more aware because it is so prevalent now. It's not just one-offs. It is this constant that we're seeing. And it is like seeping. And I hate to use the word virus because we came out of a pandemic, but it is a virus that is just spreading so rapidly. And when we are seeing communities that are ignoring it, it is all of a sudden it's like, boom, this happened. And honestly, I would say, and this is not calling anybody out on here or myself, we have failed in many respects as society by taking for granted that we thought that this was something in our history. We just didn't, and it's nobody's fault, but we realized we didn't do enough education. We are seeing 14 to 17-year-old white males who are on gaming communities. Gaming is super cool and fun, but at the same time, they are being infiltrated in chat rooms with things like the Holocaust didn't happen, slavery was false, and they're believing it because nobody taught them the opposite, or they only did very little. So that's why it is important to call it out.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Of course.
Board President Collins.
Hello, Ms. Weissel. Thank you. I'm going to start by saying, from a historical perspective, the work that the ADL has done has transformed how we look at discrimination and bias throughout the nation, and it has influenced other groups of color throughout the nation. So I want to start by prefacing that.
Thank you.
My question is with the dynamics of the results of your report, because I'm not surprised in seeing an uptick in, these discriminatory acts. I'm not surprised at that, but I wanted to get your perspective on one of the dynamics politically when you talk about the far right, because part of their discussion was to out Israel, the Democratic Party, to say that they were the true believers in, what Israel was about. And so I wanted to kind of get your perspective on that because I was kind of surprised at that because, you know, as Democrats, part of our discussion has been to kind of look at more balance some of the issues that are presented, such as, addressing the Middle East and making it something that is more balanced, and so, but yet we're seeing this uptick, in these acts of violence, against, those within the Jewish community. And so I just kind of wanted to get your perspective on that dynamic because that was the thing that's crazy to me. I'm like, okay, you're saying that you're the, you are the true believers, but at the same time, when you look at many of the results and actions, it doesn't really reflect that.
Yeah, well, so this is a much longer conversation than we have time for, but what I will just say is, so we have seen an unfortunate uptick in anti-Semitism and other forms of hate in all directions. I think I may have used this phrase on the webinar. Call it a Willy Wonka elevator: upways, sideways, left, right. It is not just one or the other. When it comes to the conversation around Israel, so just like any foreign government, look, I mean, we can all we're critical of the American government. What we're seeing now, unfortunately, is within political circles, and we're seeing it in kind of all sides, coming from the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Green Party, Libertarian, wherever it is. We are seeing them using Israel as this tool against the Jewish community, saying, well, it's the Jewish homeland, there are historical ties to it, but whether you vote in the Israeli election or not, you are responsible for something that happened over there. And people are conflating that here, particularly in local communities. So there's a whole discussion we could have on when anti-Israel rhetoric and anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism. But we are not just seeing that from one side or the other. We are seeing people use it to weaponize, I would say, their opponents in elections sometimes, and in other forms. And so we have to do a better job of educating about that. And when you start using classic anti-Semitic tropes, saying Jews are all powerful and controlling, for example, and so Israel has power over the United States, you've now blamed the global Jewish community for something that happened over there. We wouldn't do that with any other country. We don't blame, Asian Americans who are from China for something the Chinese government did. And we're seeing that conflation, unfortunately. And so I'm happy, to have a longer conversation on it, but we are definitely seeing that weaponized. And the phrase I use is, look, hate and bias are nonpartisan problems, but they really require a bipartisan solution. And we need to do a better job of talking through that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I know we're a little past 2. I'm going to have Supervisor Bailey quickly ask her question and ask Meredith to answer, and then we'll wrap up our meeting. And I know folks may need to hop off. So,
okay. Thank you, Chairwoman. You did it great, quickly. Great. My question is, what does this look like for when we invite you into our districts or into our region to do this? What does it look like? What does a snapshot look like? Does it look like what you just presented, or do you craft it for the districts? I mean, what does it look like?
Yeah, so this is literally the snapshot. It would be much more in depth. We could talk about what's literally happening in your particular area of your community. We can do much more in-depth training on, historical aspects of anti-Semitism, historical aspects of other forms of hate, as well, and how we're seeing it intertwined. We can take it from a kind of a anti-bias approach in many respects, and why, we see something like stereotyping happening in schools or microaggressions in workplaces, and how that is impacting. So we can tailor it in a couple of different ways. We would just have to talk. I would talk to you first and see, what is going on in the community. Are you trying to be more proactive or reactive to something? Wouldn't necessarily change the whole presentation, but just to get a better sense of how we want to do. We can do breakout rooms. We've done that as well with communities. So to have more like thought-provoking conversations, like we can prompt questions. It can be, there's a variety of different ways. We have a couple of different models that work. Yes. And yeah, you were on the last one, so you saw the long and the short version.
she did. Supervisor Bailey got both, so she knows. So
Thank
Meredith,
you.
I just want to really thank you all. And again, we wanted to do this as just sort of a quick overview, just to, again,
Lost your sound, Madam Chair.
I got you. Sorry. Thank you, Meredith, for that presentation. And again, this was just done quickly so that we could give you a snapshot of the longer webinar that Meredith had done for us. I appreciate you all staying on a bit longer. This concludes our board meeting for this month. As I opened, I hope all of you have a wonderful International Women's Day, and if please celebrate the women in your life, and remember, embrace equity is the theme for today and the year. So thank you all again, and I look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you.
Happy International Women's Day.